Hello and welcome to Seeing Jesus with Paul Miller. My name is Liz Boberil and I'm here with Paul Miller and our colleague John, who does training of church leaders in the U.S. and overseas. We've been in this series where we've been talking about towards the end of Jesus's life, looking in this series called The Passion. And if you've been listening, you know we talked about the disciples and how they were looking for ways to move up, get promoted, who's first, who's most important. And then in our most recent episode, we looked at Jesus and how he really enacts a parable in front of them at the Last Supper, showing them how to take the lower place. So Paul, in this episode, we're really looking to pull that in the application realm for ourselves and talk about that a little bit more, right? Like, what does it look like to take the lower place?
Yeah.
You want to take us from there?
Yeah. Thank you, Liz. Just a few reflections on humility, and I'll just give you these three principles of humility. The first one, which I kind of think we all know, is that humility is when your heart is humbled. You know, when you just it's a virtue, it's a character trait, and I think we also know this one too. Humiliation is when your circumstances are humbled, right? Those are it's a helpful to have a distinction between the two. But having been often in many dying of the dying of humility in my life, I slowly learned, actually pretty rapidly, I just have to keep relearning it, that those two things are deeply connected. The virtue of humility and the place of humiliation are connected, is because the place of humiliation is where you learn humility. Like, you do not learn humility abstractly. You could write books on it, but you have to be in a humbled place. I mean, that's, random example, Nebuchadnezzar. He learns humility by being in a low place for 7 years in the book of Daniel. And what I want to do is I want to pick an example that is kind of a feisty example, particularly for our culture, where the husband is the bad guy, okay? And he's very thoughtless and mean to his wife. So, and by the way, this is a theoretical example, okay? I had no couples in mind. And just to defend my usage, I've tried to do this story by flipping the husband and wife, and everybody gets mad at the husband in this, no matter which way I do it. So, and then they get mad at me too for telling it. But this kind of thing happens a lot. You know what I mean? People's lives are filled, and this story is so it's a made up story between a husband and wife where the husband's the bad guy. And I'm going to ask the wife to do something very difficult, like what Jesus did. And, so let me just jump into the story. Now that I've said it, you're going to think, well, what a horrible story this is. So this is a very common story, unfortunately. So, here's the situation. The husband tosses his underwear on the bedroom floor every morning. He's never made the connection between clean underwear and the activity of picking it up and washing it. Mom always picked it up for him at home. Wife doesn't. Okay. And, so in the morning, a few days go by and the husband says, as men are wont to do, honey, I'm all out of underwear. Wife, can you remember to put it in the laundry basket? That way I won't forget it. Husband says, what good would that do? You don't get the laundry done on time anyway. I mean, so you follow that? So the husband is thoughtless, and
sloppy.
Yeah. And then kind of, he was kind of innocent, complains about not having it. And his wife kind of, helps him see a connection. She's very gracious about it. And then he's mean. In the language of human relationship, the husband escalates the argument. And that's always how quarrels begin, is someone escalates. And so the most likely thing that she's going to do is, before we go on this, before we get too deep into this story, we were talking about this ahead of time. John has a real life example of this in his own life, which we don't want to miss.
Well, you were saying it's hypothetical, and it was when you originally wrote it.
Yeah.
But I was sharing with you, maybe it's not as hypothetical as you think, because one of the earliest potential arguments that Sonia and I had when we got married was later on in the afternoon, after I had already taken a morning shower and gotten on with the day. She asked me totally deadpan, "Did you get raptured this morning?" And I wasn't quite sure what she meant. And so she literally took my hand and walked me to the shower right on the mat before you step into the shower. And she said, "Look, here's your underwear and your shorts." And they are as if somebody was literally pulled out of them, and they just, they stood there. And so fortunately, this wasn't true of all of our early marital arguments, but fortunately that morning I didn't escalate it that morning, because I just started laughing. I couldn't stop laughing. And then I said, well, maybe I did.
It was a failed rapture, though.
Yeah, I'm back, but So I think I can't remember exactly, but her comment may have been, "Well, now that you're back, you better pick it up." And
But so John, thank you. You took us from the world of hypothetical to real.
Oh, yeah.
And your wife did a wonderful job of blessing you that morning. What often happens, though, in couples is that the way he escalates, when one person escalates, then the other person escalates, well, you're changing the subject, you know what I mean? This is your problem, not my problem. And again, in the escalation, usually what makes that escalation so hard to see is that usually the things, at least in the beginning part of the escalation, that what they're saying is often true. But they are, what the husband did in that situation was he put his wife in, his arrogance led him to humiliating her when he said to her, what good would that do? You don't get the laundry done on time anyway. In other words, he's doing the opposite of the atonement. Instead of humbling himself and receiving her criticism, he's pushing the criticism away and saying it's her fault. And she's now in a position of humiliation. And what do you do in that? Like, you have two choices. You can escalate, or you can move into some kind of receiving what he's doing. Just look at the list of what he's doing. Why is it hard for her to respond in some kind of, here, let me give you a response, and it's going to seem galling in our culture, and I'm going to give you a variety of responses in a minute, but let me just suggest a response that I think is thoroughly biblical, where she could say to him, "Honey, you're right. I have been late with doing the laundry." And what she's doing there is she's taking the lower place.
She's absorbing
the low-level evil from her husband. It doesn't mean there's not a place for honesty, but it's so important for us. All of us have opportunities in all our relationships to take the lower place. So let's just take that as a possible answer. And it's one of many. And there might be a lot better ones. Why is it, and Sonia's was terrific.
So, yeah. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, John.
No, I never mind. I was going to go off topic. I was going to say my confession would be, yes, I was raptured. which
I was
you
right.
know,
Okay.
yeah.
But it was a sweet way of you acknowledging, I messed up on that. So, so she's losing. Okay. I mean, that's the tough thing is in the passive humiliation, you end up on a cross, which is what Jesus told James and John, and what happened to Jesus himself. Most of these crosses are like micro crosses. They're mini crosses for a minute. He's made a power move to so that he doesn't have to bear any guilt or shame. And he does that by shaming her. And, so what he's doing is really, really wrong. But in this situation, that suggestion that I have is a thoroughly biblical way to handle it. And let me throw out some other examples because there's a whole variety of ways to answer it. And again, what you're walking away though from is an escalation. And here, let me give you some examples. So one of them that she did do, which was say, "Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm slow with the laundry." One is to try to understand what we call seeJesus to incarnate. What do you mean when you say you don't do the laundry? And because maybe it's not quite true what he said. Or maybe it's not true at all what he said, and just defend yourself in an appropriate way without barbs. I don't think that's true. Another one, if this has been happening a lot in the relationship, silence might even be appropriate, like the way Jesus was silent. And sometimes we're in situations that are slave-like, where you end up picking up the underwear, where you take the lower place. And what I love about Jesus, is that this idea of taking the lower place, it is, which is a quote from Jesus, it is a place. Here, let me read John, or Liz, would you read John 10:17 to
Sure.
18 there?
The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life, only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord.
That's the gospel, or at least one way of looking at the gospel is that no one, like, and what's so, it's these, like Jesus, yeah, it's okay. He gives his life, but what God is calling us to do is to give up the pieces of our lives, these little tiny pieces. And it doesn't mean that you shut down honesty. I mean, the husband does need to have but in this moment, it's probably not a good thing, especially when he's escalated the argument. And if I were in a situation like this, I would go to prayer. And, this is, the way he's treated his wife is really shameful. And so you've got things in your heart to pray for. How do I be honest? How do I avoid quarreling? And praying for both your heart and for your husbands. And this is that's why so many women are praying women. They're often find them in situations like this. But what I love about John is if you're in a situation like this where you have to pick up the underwear, it's not your fault. In a situation like that, you are an act of the will, just like Jesus. You are taking it. Like you're making a decision to enter into humility.
And I think that's why when you're talking about little pieces, this story, as funny as it can be, is not only real life for so many of us, but in some ways it's almost the harder thing to do in the sense that I remember being with some pastors overseas, in a closed country, and they've gone through and are going through tremendous suffering. And I made a comment in one of our trainings. I said, I heard that for many of you in your current situation, that it would be easier for you to actually literally lay down your life for your faith in your place of ministry and where you are at than it is to potentially do the dishes for your wife or do the very thing that we're talking about in this story. And I was shocked because I said, I don't want to assume that. And they all unequivocally agreed.
That's great. That's really a great job.
That it would be so much easier for them literally to give them, and they were semi-joking, but they were serious. Like, it's those micro pieces and that are repeated, or, that actually just grate at the flesh and the soul in good ways that, it's like giving your life is huge, but it's one and done. And then you're in glory if you're in Christ. But to have that kind of what we're talking about, I mean, I'm sure a lot of our listeners are, as they're imagining themselves in that situation and potentially responding in one of the 5 ways that you said, Paul, I'm sure there's a lot of things in our own hearts that are just kind of like getting twisted up and going, I don't know about that,
That's really, I think that's a universal experience. I'm actually thrilled that you said that. And it shows that we've not yet quite made the connection between Jesus' death and our own, and those little deaths. And most of my stories and examples are these little things like that. And look what the Gospels are giving us. I mean, one was a fight, an argument, about that they had on the road while they were in the chariot. I mean, they didn't ride in chariots. I mean, at least the disciples didn't. But while they were in the car, they had an argument on the way, and it had to do with favoritism in a small community. And then the second argument was about 2 guys trying to get ahead of other people. And then the next argument, likely, if Edersheim is right, on seating order, like they are, they're the kinds of things that all get duplicated in our lives. Okay, let me do a pitch, for humility, on the 6 blessings of humility. And so thinking back to our story of this now we know she's a non-hypothetical wife. Just things that happen that make the low place a place of beauty. And one of them is that the argument stops. And sometimes you need to pursue arguments, but in general, if you can move to a piece of shalom, even if it's temporary shalom, even if there's injustice there, that you take it's just like what you do with a fire. You all know, if you've done any camping or fire building, whatever, you know that when you can put out a fire with water, but you can also do the same thing just by pulling the logs apart. When fires die for lack of fuel, and quarreling dies when one person takes the low place. So the second one is you're no longer controlled by the last thing that the person said. So you're not caught in these cycles. But to break the cycle, you do have to take the low place. You have to lose, but you're no longer controlled by them. And that way you can get away. You can take time to pray. Sometimes with things like this, I might pray for months and years. If it's a group of people, I might pray for a year, or longer, sometimes decades. Because you just, like, anytime you get a group that's putting you in a low place, you're up against things that are much more stronger than you are, and God has to do the work. Here's some of the really fun things, though. Those are the practical things. The third thing is the blessing of the place of humiliation is we can see clearly in the low place. It's a place of seeing clearly. Down low, you can see yourself clearly. You can see other people clearly. It's one of the remarkable little side benefits. John or Liz, want to add anything to any of those?
Well, I think it's counterintuitive to what we want to do because we want to take the higher place thinking that we'll have a better view of the situation.
Right. I never thought it. Right. Yes.
And so to take the lower place, I mean, yeah. And the reason it becomes clear is because that's where Christ often is in that low place.
I also think that that idea of not being controlled by the other person is also, I think sometimes you feel like perhaps you're getting control by staying engaged, right? Trying to get the next word, but you're actually usually hooked in some way, right? Like, so I do think that's very true is you step out of it. But the self-deceived piece is the part that is trying to have control by staying in rather than letting go.
Yeah. Yeah. We just all heard this on prayer meeting this morning, and one of our staff, it was Brian, was visiting up in New York, and Brian, he always talks about slinging Jesus around, and New York is a much more secular place than where Brian lives down south, and he was at a coffee house and started chatting with people and just trying to get some kind of conversation going because he loves to sling Jesus around, as he called it. And he didn't get anywhere, it just absolute zero. And he noticed there were some homeless guys out front of the coffee shop with a sign that said "Warriors for God." I have no idea why. Maybe they were vets or something like that. And he decided to go out and with them and chat with them. And he had a great conversation with them for 15 minutes. And a lot of the people inside the coffee shop noticed him outside talking with these homeless people. And it was just a beautiful, he had a great conversation with the homeless men, and they were able, they didn't know it, the crowd, but I bet you some of them did. They were seeing Jesus. It was a place of clear seeing of people actually even seeing what you're like. Anyway, I should have stole the thunder on that story because you guys heard it too. Wasn't that a lovely story? Another one, which is very central to Paul, the apostle's thinking, the fourth one is we meet Jesus in a low place. That's why Paul in Philippians 3 verses 10 and 11 calls our dying with Christ a fellowship of sharing in his suffering. It is a place where you get to know Jesus. It's just, he is present down low. It's almost like he's always, like a piece of him never left the low place. Jesus himself is humble. And he says that in Matthew 11, verse 30, "Learn from me, for I'm gentle and humble of heart, and you will find rest for your souls." And one of the things that we do a lot in the Person of Jesus study is show the tight connection between humility and love. It is that like they are attached at the hip. So the fifth way that we see the blessings of the place of humility is our ego dies in the place of humiliation. The self, the flesh, goes through a kind of a death. And there's the permanent death that we've received by being born again. And there's these ongoing deaths that we need. And they're like rocket fuel for resurrection. And it is the place of the beginning of spiritual power, which is the sixth point, is in the low place. God acts on our behalf. So Luke 14, verse 11, Jesus says, "He who humbles himself will be exalted." He's teaching that, but it also describes the entire story of his life. He who humbles himself will be exalted. Or the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, the Beatitudes, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." Jesus, the meekest person who ever lived, since Moses, will inherit all the earth. And that's what happens at his ascension and at his resurrection and ascension. and it's the pattern of his whole life. So that was like an advertisement or the pitch deck for taking the low place.
I'd love to see humility do like a big ad buy at the Super Bowl. It feels like kind of antithetical to the whole operation. But anyway, all right. So this is our encouraging us in our work of taking the lower place, sometimes dealing with our raptured relatives or those kinds of things. But it's good. Any last reflections, John or Paul?
No, I'm good. I mean, it goes without saying the low place does not feel good, so that it's just in a world that where we are committed to our feelings. One of the, there's this whole emphasis in our modern culture on self-care and boundaries. Those are not bad things. Those are good things to do. Everyone should have boundaries. Jesus has them. Everybody should do self-care. But because they've gone to the center of our culture, what people do then is use boundaries to avoid the humiliation of difficult family members or difficult relatives or difficult people at work. And it is such a beautiful thing to enter into the low place. And as Jesus, as Isaiah says, speaking for God, I dwell in the high and lofty place, and with him that is a humble and a contrite heart. And so there's that juxtaposition of God's glory being so amazing, but when you actually get to look at it closely, you see the humiliation of God. So it's the cross and resurrection are just sort of two different sides of the same coin.
Paul, you put it in a way that I thought this phrase was nice. It's in the notes for this. You said the notes for this lesson. You say, God is on the other side of the dirty underwear.
That's right.
Let that encourage you as you stoop to the low place. God is on the other side of the dirty underwear.
That actually came from a couple that I was mentoring, friends of mine, and the wife was maybe not as helping out on the laundry as much as she could have, and so it was an actual thing, and yet she wanted a closer relationship with God, and she wanted it in the abstract. And this is one of the grandest principles of the New Testament is that at one level, yes, we come to understand God by faith. That's the core. We are believers, that's our label. We live by faith, it's how we're born again. So faith is the bottom. But if you just think that you can grow by just growing your faith, it is the actual and the work of love that gives a feedback loop that grows your faith. And that's so I would tell her Jesus is at the bottom of the laundry basket. So if you want to get to know Jesus better, then you'll do the laundry and you'll discover Jesus at the bottom of the laundry basket.
Paul, I just think there's so many washing machines that are going to be set in motion as this episode closes, as everyone empties out the laundry basket and gets to that work of laundry and love. So thank you. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, John. Thanks for listening. We'll be back in a couple of weeks.